The sound of the door slamming still echoed in my ears when I realized everyone in the room was looking at me. His words, dry and sharp, still hung in the air like a suspended knife. "Get out of my house now." There was no shouting, no arguing, just that icy command that felt like it ripped the ground from under my feet. I stood there, trying to process, as my mother slowly stood up, her eyes wide, unsure if she should intervene. My aunts and uncles and cousins looked at each other, some with genuine astonishment, others with that curious look of people just waiting for the next chapter in the drama. And there I was, in the middle of them all, feeling my face burn. My father didn't look away. His eyes were steady, but there was something in them, something that wasn't just anger. It was almost like fear. This confused me even more. I had no idea what I could have done to deserve this, at least not that night. For a moment, I thought he was going to back away, to explain, but he simply turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the doorway, everyone watching. It was the first time in my life I felt like there was no longer a place for me in this space I called home. Share this story to reach further, subscribe to the channel, share this video on WhatsApp, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I'll be very happy to read each comment. I took a deep breath, looked at everyone one last time, and left, feeling the weight of the door close behind me, as if it were the end of an entire chapter of my life. The street was cold and empty, and I stood there for a few seconds, trying to decide whether to go back and demand an explanation, or simply leave. The porch light was still on, but the house felt distant, as if it had closed itself off from me forever. As I walked, flashes of the night flashed through my mind. Until half an hour earlier, everything had seemed normal. Laughter at dinner, conversations about old memories, the sound of silverware hitting plates, and then suddenly, that sentence. There had been no warning, no argument leading up to it. It was as if my father had waited for the right moment to pluck me away. I reached the car and sat in the driver's seat, without turning on the ignition. The image of his gaze, so hard yet filled with something I couldn't quite identify, haunted me. It wasn't just disapproval, it was something deeper, more personal, almost as if he were protecting me from something I couldn't see. I remembered the stories my grandmother used to tell, how my father had always been reserved about certain family matters, and how he avoided talking about certain parts of the house, especially the attic. I never gave it much thought, until now. As I stared in the rearview mirror, I realized I wasn't ready to leave yet. Not without knowing what really happened inside. I sat in the car for almost 10 minutes, watching the shadows of the house reflected on the street. The night chill began to seep through the cracks in the window, but I didn't move. Something inside me insisted that leaving without answers would torment me forever. I took a deep breath, got out of the car, and walked back to the door, my steps slow and almost silent, as if I were afraid of being overheard. As I approached, I noticed that the porch light was now off, and all the windows were dark. It was as if the house had fallen into the deep sleep of someone who didn't want to be disturbed. I turned the doorknob slowly, expecting it to be locked, but to my surprise, it gave way easily, producing a soft click that sounded much louder in the stillness of the night. The room was empty. The dinner table still had half-empty glasses and plates with leftover food, as if everyone had left in a hurry. The air was heavy with a faintly sweet scent that hadn't been there before. I felt a shiver run up my spine, and the strange feeling that I wasn't alone washed over me. I passed through the hallway and noticed that the attic door was ajar, something that never happened. My father always kept that door locked, and I grew up forbidden from going up there. The fact that it was open now felt like an invitation, or a warning. I stood before it, feeling my heart race, as if some part of me already knew the answer was there. Then I heard footsteps coming from upstairs. They weren't hurried or heavy, but rhythmic and slow, as if whoever was there knew exactly what I was listening to. The sound echoed down the narrow hallway, each beat mingling with my own heartbeat, and it was at that moment that I realized that maybe my father wasn't kicking me out of anger, but to keep me away from whatever was up there. I climbed the steps slowly, feeling the wood creak beneath my feet, as if the house itself were trying to stop me. The dim light came from a bulb hanging by a cord in the center of the attic, flickering as if flickered on and off by an invisible breath. The air was cooler here, and the sweet scent I'd smelled in the living room was much stronger now, almost sickening. In the right corner, I saw an old table covered in yellowed papers, black and white photographs, and objects that seemed to belong to another era. I approached one of the photos and recognized the backyard, but with something strange, a blurry figure in the corner, watching from afar. It was hard to tell if it was a man or a woman, but the silhouette looked familiar. As I examined the objects, I noticed a chest locked with a padlock. It had deep scratch marks, as if someone had tried to force it open numerous times. I knelt down to get a better look, and then I heard a crack behind me. I whipped around and saw, for a split second, a tall shadow move around the corner of the attic before disappearing into the darkness. My body froze. I remained there, kneeling, trying to understand if I had really seen that or if my mind was playing tricks on me. The silence returned, but now it was a lively, attentive silence, as if something were observing me unhurriedly. I looked down and saw that, on top of the trunk, there was a piece of paper that hadn't been there before. It was just one sentence, written in a firm hand. "He knows you're back." I picked up the paper carefully, as if the mere touch might trigger something. The handwriting was strange, almost identical to my father's, but with small imperfections that left me wondering. As I studied the letters, a memory surfaced. Years ago, I'd found a similar note inside one of my school books saying, "Don't go back to the attic." At the time, I thought it was a joke. Now, it didn't seem that way anymore. I decided to go downstairs and confront my father immediately. But when I reached the living room, I realized he wasn't there, neither he nor anyone else. The entire house was silent, and the lights were off. I grabbed my cell phone to call him, but there was no signal, as if the house were a hole with no connection to the outside world. I looked at the door and seriously considered leaving, but something was holding me back. Maybe it was the need for answers. Maybe it was the fear that if I left, I'd never understand what had happened. I took a deep breath and returned to the attic, determined to open the trunk no matter what. I forced the lock until I heard a click. The lid slowly opened, releasing a strong scent of old wood mixed with the same sweet odor that permeated the air. Inside were several photos, all in sequence, showing my family together at different times. But there was one disturbing detail. In each one, somewhere in the corner, was the same blurred figure, ever closer with each image. In the last photo, taken the night before, the figure was right behind me, almost touching my shoulder. The shock made my body shudder. I put the photo back in the trunk, but before I could close it, I heard quick footsteps climbing the attic stairs. The wood groaned under the weight of someone making no attempt to be silent. My heart raced, and instinctively, I turned off the hanging lamp, plunging the room into darkness. The door banged open, and the hallway light revealed my father, sweaty and pale-faced. He hurried in, closing the door behind him, and fixed me with a look of despair. "I told you to leave because she already knows who you are," he said breathlessly. I tried to ask who she was, but he shook his head, as if any word might draw unwanted attention. He knelt beside the trunk, began gathering up the photos, and quickly putting them away, as if the mere fact of them being on display was dangerous. "If she leaves the picture, there's no way to put her back." My father then pushed me toward the exit, but before I could take a step, the sweet smell grew stronger, so intense it almost made me vomit. Turning my head, I noticed that in the most recent photo, still on the table, the figure was no longer there. It was at that moment that we heard slow footsteps, but coming from inside the attic. The footsteps were heavy, slow, and coming from a place that shouldn't have been there. The corner of the attic had been empty seconds before. My father and I froze, trying to locate the sound. Each thud against the floor seemed to vibrate the air, as if the entire space were reacting to the approaching presence. The reflection in the attic window revealed it first, a tall, slender silhouette, standing behind us, even though no one was physically there. Its outline was shifting, almost like thick smoke trying to take shape. I felt my body react before my mind, a sharp shiver, my heart racing, my breath shallow. My father pushed me back and stood between me and the figure, as if he could protect it. "Don't look directly at it," he said in a low, grave tone. But it was impossible. It was as if something was forcing me to look, like an invisible magnet pulling my attention. And the longer I stared, the more the silhouette became clearer, until its features resembled my own. The sweet smell became unbearable, and the lamp shook so fast, it felt like it was about to explode. My father grabbed my arm and tried to drag me out, but the attic door slammed shut on its own, the latch turning as if it had been locked from the inside. In the silence that followed, a whisper rang through the air. "Now he knows you're back." And it didn't seem to be directed at me alone. My father grabbed the key from his pocket and ran to try to open the door, but the latch wouldn't budge, as if held by something stronger than metal. As he struggled with the lock, I felt the air behind me shift, growing heavier and colder. A shadow fell across the floor, stretching until it touched my feet. I looked down and saw long, thin fingers slowly emerge from the shadows, as if something were trying to lift itself out. My instinct was to back away, but the ground seemed to stick beneath my shoes. The temperature plummeted, and my vision blurred, as if the surroundings were being drained of color and sound. Suddenly, my father yelled, "Run!" He'd managed to unlock the door and shoved it hard enough to slam it against the wall. I ran down the hallway, but I heard footsteps behind me, too fast to be human. It was as if they were running along the walls and ceiling, surrounding me on all sides. When I reached the stairs, I felt something grab my ankle. I looked down and saw a thin, pale hand emerging from the very shadow of the step. I forced my leg free, but the pressure increased, burning and freezing at the same time. My father appeared behind me and stomped down on the shadow, which dissolved with a sharp hiss, like steam being released. We wasted no time in running downstairs, but when we reached the living room, we saw the most recent photo hanging on the wall, and in it, we both stood exactly as we had in the attic seconds before. The photo hanging on the wall wasn't the same one my father kept in the trunk. It was larger, clearer, and showed details that should never have been there. In the corner, the figure wasn't as blurry as before. It now had a face, and that face alternated between mine and his, as if deciding which to assume. Each blink revealed a different version. I moved closer, unable to resist, and realized the image wasn't completely static. The curtains in the background moved slightly, as if the wind from the room were entering the photo. I saw my own reflection move its fingers, even though I wasn't moving. It was like looking into a mirror, where the me on the other side had a will of its own. My father stepped between me and the frame, telling me not to stare for too long. His voice was heavy with urgency, but also with an old weariness, as if he'd been through this before. The more you look, the more it pulls. It was like that with your grandfather. The name sounded heavy, bringing back vague memories of stories he'd always avoided. The figure then moved within the photo, crossing the space between us until it stood directly behind our images. There was no expression on its face, just a fixed, almost curious stare. But something in the air changed. It was denser, as if the room had been vacuumed shut. And that's when I noticed a detail that made my stomach turn. The shadow projected on the living room floor didn't correspond to me or my father. Instinctively, I turned to look at the opposite wall, where there was an antique mirror my mother insisted on keeping. The reflection showed my father beside me, but it didn't show me. In my place stood the figure, tall, motionless, staring directly at me through the glass, while in the real world, I remained still. Panic made me take a step back, but the reflection didn't follow. The figure remained in the same spot, as if trapped there, just waiting for the right moment to emerge. My father, noticing my gaze, covered the mirror with a cloth, but the feeling of being watched didn't diminish. It was then that we noticed the photo on the wall was changing again. Now, it wasn't the attic in the background, nor the living room. It was a place I knew very well, my bedroom, exactly as it had been before I left for dinner that night. And in the center of the image, with my back to it, was someone sitting on my bed. My father ran to the frame, trying to pry it off, but the wood was stuck to the wall as if it were part of the structure. The more he pulled, the more the figure in the picture seemed to slowly turn, as if it knew we were watching. The face began to appear, and in that instant, I knew I couldn't see the rest. But it was too late. The eyes were already staring at me. Her gaze caught me like an invisible hook. She didn't blink. She didn't look away. And the more I tried to look away, the more I felt that silent force pulling me back. It was as if the room had disappeared around me, and only the space between us existed, an endless corridor that began at the frame and ended at my eyes. My father was shouting something behind me, but the sound seemed distant, muffled, as if I were underwater. Then, without warning, the figure took a step forward, and that step went beyond the limits of the photograph. First the foot, then the leg, and then the entire body, passing through the glass as if it were water. It made no sound, but the air became much heavier, almost impossible to breathe. The temperature dropped sharply, and every hair on my body stood on end. My father pulled me back, pushing me toward the hallway. With every meter we gained, I felt her presence following us, unhurried, but certain she would catch up. It was as if she didn't need to run. as if she already knew there was nowhere to escape. The shadows on the walls lengthened and twisted, following our movements like invisible tentacles. We reached the kitchen door, and instinctively I tried to open the back door to escape. But outside, there was no street, no backyard. There was only an endless hallway, with weathered wooden walls and dim lighting, identical to the one in the attic. The sound of footsteps behind us echoed, closer than before, and this time slow enough for us to know she was enjoying the chase. My father slammed the door shut, leaning against it to prevent it from opening. "She can't be out here," he said, his voice shaking not from exertion, but from pure fear. I'd never seen my father like this, and it made me realize the danger was far more real than I'd imagined. That's when something started knocking on the other side, not violently, but with a measured, patient rhythm, as if it had all the time in the world. The knocking stopped as suddenly as it had begun, and a tense silence fell over the kitchen. My father signaled me to be quiet, and for a few seconds, I thought the threat had receded. But then, from the small window above the sink, something moved. The glass was fogged with cold, and a pale hand with long, slender fingers slid slowly across the outside, leaving marks on the surface. The problem was that the window looked into the house, not out to the backyard. I approached slowly, trying to see beyond the glass, and realized that on the other side was a narrow, dark hallway, lit by a dim light that flickered like a candle about to go out. And at the end of that hallway, there she was, standing, motionless, looking at me with a smile that seemed to stretch wider than her face should allow. My father pulled me away from the window and began speaking rapidly, saying that the hallway didn't physically exist, but was a path she used to get inside. The longer someone stared at it, the closer they would be to crossing it and never coming back. I felt a deep chill, as if I'd already taken the first step without realizing it. The whole house began to creak, as if alive and reacting to her presence. The walls creaked, the ceiling vibrated slightly, and the light flickered in a strange pattern, almost like breathing. My father grabbed a box of matches and a small bottle of alcohol, saying that if necessary, he would burn the entire house to the ground to prevent her from staying. I wanted to believe this would work, but then I heard her voice, clear and close, as if she were right next to me. "You don't have to let me in. I'm already here." Her voice echoed within me as if it had been spoken in my own thoughts. My body froze for a few seconds, and it was my father who pulled me to the center of the kitchen, away from the doors and windows. He looked at me with an expression that mixed urgency and desperation, and said something that chilled my blood. "If she takes you now, I won't be able to bring you back." There was no doubt, no hesitation. He spoke as if he had seen this happen before. Suddenly, the lights went out completely, plunging us into pitch black. My father lit a match, and the small flame revealed that we were no longer alone in the room. In the corner, beside the refrigerator, her silhouette stood out, motionless, her face still partially hidden by the shadows. But her eyes shone like two slits of pale light. She began to move, each step seeming to challenge the physical space of the kitchen. It was as if the distance between us was closing without her actually having to walk. My father poured rubbing alcohol on the floor and struck another match, creating a barrier of flame between us and her. The fire illuminated her face for an instant, and I saw something that made me shudder. It didn't just look like me, it looked exactly like me. The figure stopped, but didn't back away. Instead, it tilted its head slightly and smiled, as if pleased that I'd finally noticed. The heat of the fire didn't seem to bother it. On the contrary, it seemed to cast denser shadows behind it, like arms reaching out toward us. My father grabbed my shoulder and yelled for me to run, but before I could move, her voice filled the entire kitchen, speaking in my own intonation. "He can't stop me. We're already the same." We ran down the hallway, the sound of her footsteps echoing unhurriedly, as if she were deliberately giving us a head start. We reached the living room, and to my surprise, the photo on the wall had changed once again. Now it showed exactly what was happening at that moment. My father and I, standing in the middle of the room, staring at the frame, and behind us, the figure, getting closer and closer. My father positioned himself between me and the photo, telling me I needed to leave the house immediately, but at the same time, he hesitated, as if unsure if letting me leave would solve anything. It was then that I realized there was something more to the image. In the reflection of the window within the photo, there weren't just the three of us. There was another version of me, outside, waiting. The air grew colder, and an invisible pressure began to push against my back, driving me toward the frame. Each step I took seemed to sap my strength, as if the ground were draining my energy. My father held my arm, but the force pulling me was stronger. It was like trying to resist a current. The figure was now leaning against the frame, and I had the feeling that it didn't just want to step through. It wanted me to step into its place. The voices in my head multiplied, all with my voice, telling me that the exchange was inevitable. My father looked at me, his eyes welling up, and whispered, "If you go in, there's no going back. But if I go in your place, maybe." And in that moment, I knew he was willing to sacrifice himself. For a moment, the idea of letting my father make the sacrifice seemed tempting, not out of selfishness, but because of the way he looked at me, with a quiet determination that said he was ready to pay the price. But that very expression was what made me back away. I knew that if I let him cross, I would spend the rest of my life burdened by the loss of him because of me. The pressure from the frame increased, and the glass trembled as if something on the other side was pounding against it, impatient for the exchange to happen. The figure, my face distorted, smiled slowly, almost mockingly, and reached out through the rippling surface like water. It was as if he were offering me a choice he had already made for me. The corridor in the background seemed brighter, illuminated by a yellowish light, and I could see shadows moving within, as if there were others, waiting. My body was pulled forward, one step at a time, as my father held my arm tightly, trying to be the anchor that kept me on this side. In a desperate rush, I looked away and reached for any heavy object that might break the frame. I saw the old trunk from the attic leaning against the wall, and without thinking, I grabbed it with both hands. The wooden edges cut my fingers, but adrenaline kept me from feeling the pain. I lifted the trunk above my head, and with a scream, threw it against the frame. The impact didn't sound like glass breaking. It was more like a tear in reality, followed by a deep scream, so loud it shook the windows. The wind exploded inside the house, scattering the papers through the air as if sucked into an invisible whirlpool. The curtains flapped violently, and I smelled a strong, burning smell mixed with the sweet aroma that had accompanied her presence. The figure retreated into the image, trying to grasp something to keep herself out, but her hands sank into the glass like quicksand. The hallway darkened quickly, and before she disappeared, I heard my own voice from inside. "This won't hold me forever." The glass reformed itself, cracked like ice beneath the surface, and the frame remained attached to the wall, but now it felt heavier, as if something alive was still inside, breathing slowly. My father and I looked at each other, breathless, and he was the first to speak. "Never look at it again," he said with a seriousness that left no room for questions. He took a thick cloth and draped it over the photo, covering it completely, like closing the lid of a coffin. The silence that followed was almost deafening. The sweet smell faded, the air became lighter, and for the first time in hours, I was able to breathe deeply. But the sense of relief was fragile, as if we were merely in the interval between one attack and the next. We left the house without looking back, each footstep echoing on the wooden floor, like a warning not to return. Even today, when I close my eyes at night, I feel that narrow hallway before me, the dim light at the end, and the outstretched hand waiting for me in the darkness. No matter how hard I try to push that image away, a part of me knows that one day, it will find a way back. Share this story to reach more people. Subscribe to the channel, send it to someone on WhatsApp, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Maybe you've felt someone looking at you through a picture frame.